Welcome, Vector T13 is with you. And this video is a video guide to the new version of AntiDetect 5 Revision R 521B. This video is also suitable for users of personal versions and users of the Patreon version. And what are their differences, we will now analyze. Also, for those users who already have experience with my software, I recommend paying attention to the time codes in the description of this video so that you can go to the part of this video guide you are interested in. But still, my personal recommendation is to read this video guide in full, because even though some users are extremely experienced, repetition is the mother of learning and is the key to success. So I recommend watching this video in full. And we begin. So, we are now with you on the Detect Expert website. This web resource presents two different software from the AntiDetect section. The first software is Patreon AntiDetect, the second software is Personal AntiDetect. We will now focus our attention on their differences. We go to the Software AntiDetect System tab and go down a little further down the page. Here we will compare our AntiDetect with the browser one. This, by the way, is a fairly popular question. What is the difference between Vector T13 AntiDetect and browser AntiDetect? After all, there are no anti-detections based on virtual machines, except for one of mine. There are some patches for older versions of my AntiDetect, for versions from 2022, 21st, or there are certain patches for the VMware hypervisor. But there is a big difference, which is that VirtualBox has an OSE edition, that is an open source edition that allows us to completely change everything we need. While VMware is a closed source product and is not subject to any change other than a rather inconvenient patching, the result and effectiveness of which remains in question. And of course, it is impossible to avoid detecting virtual machines with the help of such patches. Therefore, an anti-detect based on virtual machines, a full-cycle anti-detection, is only an anti-detect from Vector T13. Browser anti-detections, unlike my anti-detection, there are a great many of them, more than 200 at the moment. And they actually differ in design, in some cases functionality, but still they are maximally aimed at working with various kinds of checkers. And here, I would like to give you a small example. If you want to use browser-based anti-detections, and many users are fine with them because they are lightweight, easy to handle, and can run on very old hardware. But I would like to draw your attention to one important point right away. How to check whether the anti-detect that is in front of you is good or not. Take some page of the checker's website, or better yet, go to the Gemini or ChatGPT neural network and ask them to write a page for you to check, for example, a Canvas fingerprint, or WebGL, or any other fingerprint. They will give you a code that you can save locally on your computer. Then, try to run this code inside your AntiDetect browser. And you will have two scenarios. The first scenario, you will always get the same fingerprint despite the fact that you try to replace it in your AntiDetect browser. The second option, indeed, it is possible that you will get a change to this fingerprint despite the fact that it is a local page that is loaded from your PC. What's the difference? Many users are misled by checkers, since checkers are an incredibly cool marketing tool that allows you to show the user the effectiveness of a software product, that is, browser anti-detection. But the only problem is that most anti-detect browsers target these checkers specifically. And if you take this site checker and save it to your local PC, then no substitution will work, because they replace only the address of the web resource or the address of the executable script. By the way, I have already mentioned a similar technique, namely working with TamperMonkey browser extensions in my webinars. I recommend paying attention to my YouTube channel, and you will be able to make yourself a browser anti-detect yourself. In our case, in the case of working with virtual operating systems, we do not aim to change fingerprints. Agree, in 2025, it is rather foolish to expect that security systems invented 10 years ago, and 10 years ago an antidote was found against them, at the moment can have any real weight. After all, if we want to protect ourselves, and you and I, for example, are directors of large companies, we are unlikely to use a technology that can be easily changed with the help of any browser extension or can be changed by hand. The fact is that you can make 1 million canvas prints, 2 million WebGL fingerprints, and sites will actually use these technologies. However, they will use them as a honeypot to determine when an anti-detect system is used and when it is not. And I would like to draw your attention to the honeypot here, and various kinds of checker sites. Personally, my opinion, and I always try to teach users this, you don't have to check yourself on checker websites before your work. If you just want to evaluate the effectiveness of the software, please go to any checker site that you need. But if you go to this resource, to the checker site before your work, and try to see if your fingerprints have changed or what quality your IP has, well, this will be equivalent to the fact that before committing a crime, you will go to the local police station and ask, "Gentlemen policemen, today I have a new gun, today I am in different clothes. Don't you recognize me?" Of course, you will be told, "No, we won't recognize you." But at the same time, you are already being watched. The same thing happens when a user wants to check himself on some checker site that is connected to an anti-fraud system. An incredibly simple and yet effective honeypot. Therefore, if you want efficiency in your work, the first thing you need to remember is to refuse any checker sites. You're only killing your IP address, you're only killing the subnet of your IP address and your IDs and nothing more. So back to our anti-detections. Vector T13 anti-detect is a full cycle anti-detection. That is, we emulate hardware with all its functionality, we emulate peripherals, we fully affect the operating system itself, and in derivative, we affect the browser. That is, in fact, we do not perform almost any manipulations with the browser, except for some functionality we have hardwired, for example, aging the browser. In all other respects, we can work with absolutely legal official versions of browsers, no matter what kind of browser it is. In particular, I would like to return to the topic of prints here. If you still want to use various kinds of identifier changes under the influence of the public and the masses, you can do it in our case, in our software. And this substitution occurs at the level of drivers, and accordingly, in any browser that you open, any site that you open, everywhere the substitution will be carried out. You don't need to do anything manually because, again, everything happens at the driver level. Let's move on. Anti-detect, what versions does he have? There is a version called Premium Edition, or it is also called Patreon Premium Edition. This version is for evaluation purposes only, and is suitable for many cases when users do not need a serious powerful tool that can hold thousands of accounts, but simply need to hide their IDs in front of the online banking site where they have some funds, or if the user needs to hide their geolocation while they are is located in another part of the world. That is, for household purposes, let's call it that, for the purpose of storing any financial resources, transactions with them, and so on. But if the user needs to create accounts in bulk, bypass large anti-fraud systems, then in this case the Personal Edition is suitable for him. What is Personal Edition and what types of it are available? Historically, Personal Edition is a version of anti-detection which was created individually for each user. At the moment, we have simplified this process. And how does it work? There are two versions of the Personal Edition. These are Personal Edition and Personal Edition Core. What is the Core version and what is the Personal Edition? How do they differ? When a user contacts us to purchase software, a separate profile is created for this user with his data. I will not disclose what data. This is purely technical data. This does not mean that we create profiles where your email, IP address, and so on are. We do not collect this information. I'm talking about those points that will, let's say, represent you online on behalf of this software. This profile was previously sewn in, separately into each copy. It was unique. At the moment, we have made a core version that allows you to download this profile automatically from our servers when registering software. That is, this way, you don't have to wait for about 2 weeks for your software development to take place. You can start working immediately, almost within 3 days of purchase. But there is one more interesting point here that I would like to draw your attention to. The fact is that the effectiveness of the equipment that we use inside the Anti-Detect also depends on what kind of host equipment you have. And if you use, for example, some old processor, this old processor may not support the new functionality that is inside Anti-Detect itself. And accordingly, what does this lead us to? Leads to the fact that when any software inside Anti-Detect requests access to certain functionality or processor leaves, a critical error may occur that completely paralyzes the system. Or the second example. If we claim a certain performance inside our browser, and the performance on the T is an incredibly important metric at the moment since it is almost impossible to replace it. If we claim high performance and at the same time we use an old computer, then again we will have problems, a mismatch. Therefore, in such cases, of course, the user receives a really ordinary Personal Edition, that is, a personalized version for him, where a set of equipment and all identifiers are developed specifically for him. I would also like to say that each user can get such a personal version, unlike the core version. That is, if you want to work faster, as fast as possible, and you don't have specific tasks, you can work with the Personal Edition core version. If you have specialized equipment, complex web resources, then I recommend that you apply for a personal version. In financial terms, there is absolutely no difference. All updates are free, so you can always get the updates you need absolutely free of charge. But Personal Edition updates take a little longer because they are done manually. Manual assembly, so to speak. So, what is the main feature of the Personal Edition? There are a few different types of personal versions that you can see on your screens. These types are distinguished by the presence of small subroutines. Let's call them presets. Presets are sets of non-obvious settings. What is the secret? Why, for example, can't you use a preset from Google, for example, with a preset from Barclay and vice versa? I will not disclose all the technical details, but I will give an example. There are a huge number of anti-fraud systems in the world, and these anti-fraud systems have their own regional settings and also have settings depending on who developed the system and who manages it. That is, a system that, for example, serves a web resource in the United States may have different requirements, and the same system that serves a web resource located in the United Kingdom may have completely different requirements. At the very least, this is set with the help of the so-called GDPR norms, that is, the norms for obtaining user data. And if in the United States they are more loyal, in Europe they are stricter. That is, in the United States, more identifiers are leaked into the network and more identifiers can be used against the user, while in Europe, much less. But this is us. The example from Great Britain does not quite apply to Europe. We can, if we give a vivid example of Europe, for example, the Netherlands. But the essence, I think, is clear to you. One anti-fraud system is based on the fact that they check the IPv6 IP address. For them, it's incredibly important to have a fully working IPv6 stack. And this is almost all anti-fraud systems that work in the United States. IPv6 is incredibly important. Another anti-fraud system, for example, checks your peripheral equipment because, following its example, for example, it is some kind of bank. Following its example, corporate clients who use its services always have peripheral equipment. Printers, scanners, etc. At the same time, a home user or a user of some simple anti-detect will not report the presence of such equipment. Another example can be given: a mouse. It would seem that an incredibly simple identifier is our cursor, which we see now on the screen. However, this cursor has several coordinate parameters depending on the mode used. There are absolute coordinate parameters, which allow you to capture the entire monitor, and there are sectoral, which allow you to analyze one specific area, for example, at the level of a virtual machine window. And accordingly, when using this technology, a web resource can, for example, determine the screen resolution of your host computer, even though a virtual machine is used. And there are quite a few such examples. Why can't you include everything at once? Emulate absolutely everything. The fact is that the emulation of any additional chips is always resource intensive. That is, this example with the mouse that I just gave increases the use of the processor in order to use the coordinate spoofing system. This coordinate spoofing system increases the cost of the virtual machine by 20%. Add peripherals, add more, respectively, the problem of installing them inside a virtual machine, startup, polling by Windows services, and so on. Therefore, doing universally what will work in all cases will not be entirely good. Therefore, for the highway we have a sports car, for off-road we have a Jeep. Well, in order to fly we use an airplane. Agree, it's quite stupid to try to go through the desert on a good plane. Yes, maybe it will drive a few meters, but then it will still break. There is a solution for the desert for $10,000, but for the air, for several million. Continue? So, after you have purchased the personal version of AntiDetect or the Patreon version, you can find the software you need in your Detect Expert personal account on the Downloads tab. As I said, there are already versions of AntiDetect 5 Core available. That is, if you have bought, for example, the 5th type of personal version, you can download the core version here. Or you can contact the support, and then the support will personally give you your personal version, which is different from the core, made directly for your unique equipment. This software is produced by me personally. I assemble it manually. And in order to make this software, I need to get a report from you about your equipment, which can be produced in AIDA64 or CPU-Z programs. And based on this data, I will compile software for you to ensure maximum speed and efficiency. If you are a Patreon Premium Edition user, the corresponding software is available to you here. You won't be able to use personal versions because each personal version has its own type and license type. So, don't try to cheat fate and, having bought a subscription to Patreon, download, for example, Anti-Detect Personal Version Type 8. So, after you have downloaded the software you need to your computer, I recommend paying attention to the following important point. There have been many cases when users face problems in installing software. I will explain what it is connected with. Pay attention now to the screen. As you can see, we are located in the Program Files Vector T13 folder. At the moment, on my PC, from which I record this video, there is no version of the Anti-Detect officially installed on it. But nevertheless, the files remained. This happens for many reasons. We will not analyze them here now in order not to increase the time of this broadcast. Therefore, I just draw your attention to the fact that before you update Anti-Detect, if you already had any previous version of Anti-Detect installed, delete all files completely. Alternatively, if you are switching from, for example, the personal version to the Patreon version to the personal version, or you are upgrading between personal versions, for example, then you may have problems. I recommend deleting all files completely. For the reason that during the installation process, these files may not be replaced with new ones, and accordingly, you will get a kind of hybrid when you have part of the functionality from the new version, part of the functionality from the old one. And this leads in most cases to various kinds of errors. Therefore, check the installation folder with your antidote. Further, here's our installation file. During the installation phase of VirtualBox components, and we are talking about VirtualBox components here, not Anti-Detect components, you are told by default not to install USB drivers. Why does this happen? The fact is that USB drivers reduce the performance of the software, and in most cases users simply do not need them. But if you want, for example, to install some kind of external webcam inside the Anti-Detect itself, or to use various Wi-Fi dongles or anything else that are USB devices, then you will need to install the driver data accordingly. In all other cases, this item is disabled by default. Click Next and proceed to installation. The installation is standard from VirtualBox. In this case, there are practically no changes and it takes only a few seconds. Our software is completely ready to work. At the moment, the license has been checked. Here I want to draw your attention to the fact that the software has an item called License on the file Preferences tab. You can activate your license on the Detect Expert website by copying your machine ID and, accordingly, pasting the necessary key into the software which you will receive on the Detect Expert website. After that, your license will be active. In some cases, you may encounter blocking from providers. This happens in regions where there is strong censorship. Therefore, in such cases, I recommend using a VPN, for example, as one of the options. The fact is that we are not using a self-written system, we are using the Keegan Sage system. Anyone can register here, registration is free, and see the functionality of this anti-fraud system. This is also one of the most important differences between the software and Vector T13 and browser-based anti-detectors. After all, browser anti-detectors in most cases use their own licensing systems, which means that you cannot be sure in any way that this browser collects what information about you. In the case of using the software from Vector T13, the only connection you will find, the first connection, is to upload a file with your profile. This only happens when registering the program, that is, loading, not shipment, is an important point. And the second, respectively, connection is the connection to the Keygen SH servers. Keygen SH, this web resource, is devoid of any functionality that can harm the user's privacy. That is, there are no keyloggers, no screenshots, absolutely nothing. If anyone wants, you can analyze and reverse my software. I am fully responsible for my words and inform you that my software does not have any tracking tools. I have an absolute minimum of information about my users. The minimum that is necessary for this system of functioning licensing to function. And it functions due to two identifiers: your motherboard ID and the ID of your disk drives. No more identifiers are collected from the user's PC. I also draw your attention to the fact that the license check takes place in several stages. The first stage is when launching the software. The second stage is when starting a virtual machine. The third stage is once an hour. Accordingly, I would also like to draw your attention to one pitfall. If you are in a country with strict censorship of freedom of speech, then you may have trouble when, for example, you will have, let's say, it will inform you that the license has been successfully activated, everything is fine. But the virtual machine may not pass this license check because perhaps some block, perhaps rules and the firewall rules and so on. And in this case, if the virtual machine does not pass the license check at startup, it will start with the default VirtualBox parameters. Well, such a car, of course, will be unsuitable for work. However, in this case, you will always see a certain notification when the virtual machine starts. But now let's move on to our work. Where do we need to start? We start by creating a new virtual machine. Click on the New tab. This is the so-called expert menu for creating virtual machines. If you don't have such an expert menu for one reason or another, then I recommend that you go to the Preferences tab and go to the moment where we have our beg your pardon. Here at the top we have the basic and expert switch. Accordingly, if we choose basic, then we create a virtual machine in basic mode. If we choose to create a virtual machine in the expert mode, then accordingly the creation of the virtual machine wizard will also be in the expert form. We recently updated the interface, so I'm a little confused. But that's okay. Practice. I repeat once again, practice is what I told you at the very beginning of our lesson. Even a person who works with this software 24/7 also has the right to get confused sometimes. So, what do we need to introduce? The name of the virtual machine. I recommend using the Latin alphabet, and not using special characters. This will make it easier for you, and it will eliminate many errors that can occur when using specific characters in the name of the virtual machine. Next, the disk image. The disk image we use in this case is Windows 11 25H2, the international version. You can use any other version, but in fact I recommend using the most recent version of Windows 11. First, Windows 11 is currently more efficient than Windows 10. Second, if you use the latest version of the operating system, you'll eliminate the sheer volume of updates that the operating system might want to install. But we have the functionality to block these updates. Accordingly, if you want to use old software, please enable this functionality. I always use the latest version in my examples. We choose the language edition for the region in which we are going to work. You can download this file from the official Microsoft website absolutely free of charge. I do not recommend using any kind of build such as Windows Tiny or LTSC or others. Why? Because they lack the functionality we need. We must be 100% legitimate and 100% correspond to an ordinary real user. The kind we see on the street every day. And if we are some kind of anomalies, then the systems will treat us with great attention, and we need to avoid this attention. Further, edition, you can choose almost any you want. The easiest option is Windows 11 Home Single Language. Accordingly, we will choose it now. Further, unattended install is an automatic installation. Specifies the user's name, if you want the product key. In fact, at the moment you do not need to configure anything on your own. All settings are applied by default. Next, hardware. If you have the capabilities of your host computer, I recommend 16 GB of RAM. Well, the number of processors we have by default in the current version, version 521b, is set by default to 4. Previously, we worked on 2 CPU cores for a long time, but at the moment the 2-core policy is deprecated, and I recommend using 4 cores. Next, the Enable EFI item. An incredibly important point that you cannot disable. If you try to turn it off, you'll be notified. If you disable EFI, you will not be able to fully emulate the equipment. The equipment will work partially, and do not disable this item. Just remember once and for all. Next is the hard disk tab. All you need to do here is click Pre-allocate Full Size. If you're going to work with local software, such as exam platforms, then we set not 1 TB, but 256 GB of our disk size and choose Pre-allocate Full Size. In this case, VirtualBox is the one that will completely bite off this chunk, for example, of 256 GB of your host disk drive. And AntiDetect, in turn, will turn this disk drive into a real device. But in the event that you work with a browser, this setting is not mandatory for you. Presets. This is where the most important things are stored. This is exactly what this software will function at. They are divided into several groups. The first group is social media, the second group is marketplaces plus Gmail. Here, Gmail support has been added to all presets. Payment systems plus Gmail are the same, i.e. payment systems and Gmail. And also the MISC tab, which presents mainly cryptocurrency exchanges, bookmakers, and various kinds of web resources that are not included in any of the above categories. In our case, we will choose the Google preset. Next, the Network tab. On the Network tab, we have a group called MAC address. MAC address, we have an Ethernet vendor and a NAT vendor. The Ethernet vendor is the manufacturer of your network card, your computer's network card, and thus its MAC address. While NAT vendor and MAC address are router manufacturers. Since MAC, changing one MAC address is never enough, since always the MAC address operating at the physical level communicates with at least one more device, that is, with the router. Otherwise, why would he need this MAC address? Also a DNS server. Here you can set the DNS server you need, and it will be hard-coded by default and will not be subject to change. It is hardwired into the network device driver itself and ensures that there are no leaks. But of course, you can check out all the information on my YouTube channel. Jumping ahead, I would like to say right away, I do not recommend using public servers such as Google or Cloudflare or Quad9, VeriSign due to tracking the user and compiling a separate profile of the activity of this IP address and the activity of those web resources that this IP address visits. DNS suffix is a specific setting that is necessary in very rare cases. It allows you to completely mimic the under-E provider. DNS suffix is used when real DNS is not available. Well, let's just say with a small reservation. Imagine that we enter here, for example, a DNS suffix LAN. In this case, your browser, for example, when you want to enter in it, for example, mail, just enter mail. In this case, your browser will automatically add DNS suffix LAN and check if this resource is available. In particular, this request will also be transmitted to the DNS servers that are included in the browser itself. In other words, if you, for example, write Gmail instead of mail, then through the internal DNS address, DNS resolver, which is built in, for example, in the Chrome browser, a request will be made first gmail.lan, and then there will be a redirection to gmail.com. But nevertheless, this DNS suffix LAN, it will be fixed. In all other respects, some other web resources cannot use it. This is a specific setting that can let's just say go to identification of you only by the DNS server. Further, proxy mode. You can use a few different modes. A mode without a proxy, or Tron. Tron is an additional software that I am not the developer of, and this software will be located on your desktop when you boot the operating system. The second option is to use SOCKS 5 using the Tune2Socks software. A very old version. I do not recommend using it at the moment. In this case, it is located in our software only because this software product is currently being updated. And it is likely that in the next month or two, we will get the best proxy in the world based on this old Tune2Socks project. Well, the third option is to use the standard OpenVPN client. In this case, OpenVPN version 2 is 6.1. Using just OpenVPN is also not recommended due to the fact that there are many patterns that lead to the identification that a user is using OpenVPN. Oh, this is solved by the OpenVPN version 3, which is currently top. But alternatively, you can use OpenVPN configs, but for example, in combination with a virtual router. A prime example of a virtual router is the Jetline virtual router. And then there is time, the time zone. You can choose the state you need, the city you need here. All major cities are already here and allow you to hardcode the time zones, respectively, inside your virtual machine. Further, GPS coordinates. GPS coordinates allow us to use the necessary GPS coordinates. Well, for example, when using a GPS sensor. When you set GPS coordinates here, you have a separate device that has all the real IDs in its entirety, and it shows you exactly where you are on the map. And the most striking example that can be carried out as a test, you can launch a service, for example, Windows Maps, or use the geolocation API in the browser, and web resources will show geolocation exactly where you set using GPS coordinates data. A little lower, we have an extended block for network settings. By default, I recommend leaving it as it is. And it makes no sense to pay attention to the analysis of each of these points at the moment, since each of these points is already informative in name. The only thing that I would like to draw your attention to is the Akamai block. Until recently, this functionality was enabled by default. By default, we have always blocked the Akamai network, but at the moment this setting is no longer effective because unlike simply blocking Akamai servers, we now have the ability to simulate activity in the Akamai infrastructure. Therefore, the easiest option is to leave everything completely as it is. Next, Antios. Antios also allows us to use a particular feature depending on the need. Everything in principle is transparent and quite understandable for users. By default, the best settings are used, which are suitable for all web resources, so I recommend leaving it. Syntness. This project allows you to use a very interesting technology that allowed you to spoof DNS with any IP address you want. That is, in other words, you could set a DNS from whatever network you wanted, absolutely anything, and all the DNS tests would report that you were using the exact IP address you entered here. But this project at the moment is a little outdated and is on pause. Perhaps in the near future this project will be revived, but at the moment it has been stopped. But its functionality is still in the anti-detection, and we do not plan to remove it yet, since changes often occur in anti-fraud systems. And who knows, maybe after a while this project will be the key and will be the cornerstone in bypassing anti-fraud systems. Well, the Fingerprints tab is a tab loved by many users who came to us from browser anti-detects. Here you can change your graphics card model, you can change the canvas, you can change the canvas along with WebGL. What's the difference? Of course, it would probably be good to use powerful graphics cards, such as, for example, NVIDIA RTX 5090. But I want to draw your attention here to one rather important thing: common sense. If you are using an old computer with an old graphics card, then emulating a powerful graphics card is an absolute stupidity for you. Explain. The fact is that, as I said at the beginning of this video, performance testing techniques are currently advanced. And for example, a video card can be tested for performance using WebGL, using JavaScript, using WebGPU. And you have to admit that if your graphics card is what you claim to be 50 to 90, but at the same time you have the performance of an integrated Intel graphics card, well, that might not be entirely good for you. Therefore, you should not chase any new fashion trends. And my personal recommendation is to use either the 16th family NVIDIA or Intel graphics cards. This will be the most correct option. I choose any Intel graphics card, for example, and then we have two options for spoofing identifiers. Canvas identifier, we have certain real fingerprints sewn up, or there is a so-called random real unique fingerprint. These are the prints that we have from 1 to 10 real fingerprints. They are the most loved by users because all the checkers you want to use will always say that this fingerprint is not unique. This is like a balm for the soul for many users who like to bypass, not anti-fraud, they like to bypass checker sites. So you can use such prints. Alternatively, if you want to use a random fingerprint, you can use this add-on. But I would like to draw your attention here to the following point. We do not produce any noise effects. That is, we have a complete imprint on all the tests that you can find on the internet, and here I am talking about special laboratory tests. You will never find any noises and anomalies. The construction in this case takes place at the level of manipulation with the video card driver, and no test can detect any discrepancy in our fingerprints. Unlike the Canvas mode, WebGL, Canvas WebGL is also represented by the following modes. Disabled, i.e. the transfer of value from the host, stable fingerprints, and also artifact mode. What is the difference between Canvas mode and Canvas WebGL? Canvas mode only replaces the Canvas fingerprint and doesn't touch the WebGL fingerprint, while WebGL Canvas mode replaces both Canvas and WebGL respectively, which seems to be a good thing, and you can use it without any problems. But here it is worth paying attention to one very big trick. The thing is, you might think that this web resource that's in front of you and the fingerprint that's here, that this fingerprint depends on your graphics card. No, it does not depend on your graphics card. This is such a small discovery, perhaps, for many of you. The answer is that the canvas can be rendered not only with the graphics card, but also with the CPU, and then compare the renderings with the CPU and the graphics card, respectively. And in such cases, if, for example, you use some specific hardware, then there is a possibility to determine that rendering on the processor will not be quite typical for the processor you are working with. This often happens on server processors, on AMD processors, EPYC, and on similar kind of specific equipment, let's say. Therefore, for most cases, you can use the standard canvas mode and choose one of the real prints. I'll be using the host mode now, which is set by default. Click Finish. Our system is almost completely ready for operation, but I still want to draw your attention to several important points. Let's go into the properties of this car. You don't need to do this, but I'm just paying attention. If you suddenly want to run any virtual machine inside this virtual machine, you need to use this Enable Nested VTX add-on. In this case, it will be turn on. It will enable the hypervisor inside your virtual machine. In some cases, it is also necessary to work with various kinds of online exam platforms, where they install the software and can even see if they are inside a virtual machine thanks to this add-on. I also draw your attention to the following. If you are using an SSD, that is NVMe or SSD, I still recommend enabling this option in order to add an additional 10 to 15% of performance. I also draw your attention to the Network tab. On the Network tab, we have several modes: NAT, bridge modes, and so on. But we are now interested not in the modes of operation, but in what adapter will be used. In the AntiDetect 5.20 1B version, a new AntiDetect Real Ethernet adapter has been added. At the moment, this adapter is represented by the family R of Realtek network cards. The fact is that since 2018, when AntiDetect appeared, only a couple of network card models have been added, and the engine has remained the same for 7 years. But just recently, in this 521B update, the entire network engine was completely redesigned, and now modern drivers for video are used for Realtek network cards with all the necessary network functionality and complete freedom of action. That is, the user can configure this network card as he needs through the standard Windows Device Manager. I recommend always using this adapter, as it is currently the best in the process of bypassing anti-fraud systems. And of course, do not forget about such important points that its speed is much higher than the previous one that we used. Namely, we used this Intel Pro 1000MT desktop adapter. It is also available at the moment. You can use it if you want to for any reason, but I recommend using the AntiDetect Real Ethernet adapter. Next is the AntiDetect tab. In the AntiDetect tab, we have the option to change our network settings. This is open by default, and for those who want to change their hardware to something specific, you can find here all the necessary functionality on fine-tuning your virtual machine. Most users don't need it. Just like I'm going to give you an example of RAM. That is, we can set, for example, the presence of some RAM bars. Yes, this is important when using, for example, local software, but when using web resources, this setting is absolutely meaningless. Spending time and an extra couple of % of productivity on it is also not our priority. But if you are going to work with exam platforms or with some local software, you will still need to set RAM slots for RAM. Next is the Ports tab. The Ports tab is active by default. That is, you can see at the top we have the selector of our ports, and there is a standard set that matches your motherboard. They are already active here by default. The Miss Hardware tab allows you to emulate a mouse, keyboard, but also additional hardware parameters that the average user does not need and only needs when using local software. I have familiarized you with this tab just as it is available. In this case, you do not need to carry out any fine-tuning. In fact, the 50 minutes that I'm saying now, in practice, will only take you to download software from the Detect Expert website, install, create a virtual machine in less than a minute, and start the installation. This is what we are coming to now. We click on the Start button to start installing our virtual machine. And here, just like on a real PC, you have to press any key to start booting the operating system. The boot of the operating system has started successfully, and the installation process will now begin. I would also like to draw your attention to this installation process. The fact is that in the new version of AntiDetect, we have adapted to the new versions of Windows and slightly blocked this wonderful botnet, which is located on each of our computers. Namely, now the installation of Windows takes place completely offline. Earlier, in previous builds, when creating a virtual machine, when installing it, communication between our virtual machine and Microsoft servers already began even before we set up proxies and so on. Because in fact, all other manipulations took place after the handshake procedure between the virtual machine and Microsoft servers was performed. And then it was really clear that the user with such and such identifiers used a proxy and spoofing his data since he registered from one IP address, and then, accordingly, everything happened from another. Here. But this was only in cases where a VPN on the host was not used, for example, or a virtual router was not used. In the case of using a virtual router or VPN on the host, of course, all connections went through these network intermediaries and no identification occurred. Well, at the moment, we already have more than 50% of our operating system installed. On average, it is installed in about 3 to 4 minutes. In the meantime, let's pause for a moment and come back when it's installed and the setup process begins. So our operating system has been successfully installed, and now the process of setting it up will begin, which takes a few minutes depending on the performance of your PC and the amount of resources that we have allocated. For the current second, guest add-ons and additional drivers are installed into the system. Now the screen resolution has changed and our video drivers have been installed. And there is also the installation of additional equipment, clearing the DNS cache. And, of course, now the procedure for installing network drivers will take place. This is what I recommend you pay attention to. An important process because the health of your network depends on it. The system is configured for changes in the registry, for changes in various types of files. And now we see the installation of Realtek drivers. We see that we have drivers installed, the network test has passed, and we have access to the internet accordingly. Let's check our graphics card. To do this, go to Device Manager. And in the Network Adapters tab, we can see our Realtek Gaming Family Controller graphics card. That is, our network card has been successfully installed. And also check if the anti-OS menu works. We have an active anti-OS menu, but what this menu is, we will consider with you a little later. Now we will wait for the process of finishing the configuration. So, since we were creating our virtual machine without a proxy, I'll zoom in a bit so that you can see it better. Since we created our virtual machine without a proxy, the system offers us to install a proxy in the Thorn program, which is Tron, which is already installed on our desktop. So I'll change the screen resolution a bit. Well, for example, let's try to play with this screen resolution. Okay. Leave. I'll leave it like this. So the system offers us to install a proxy or continue working. In the event that we, for example, use a network bridge, then we do not install proxies since they are installed on the network bridge and we can continue our work. Accordingly, press the Enter key or any other key and proceed to the process of further configuration. Our network connection is currently being tested. It is set just after the check for the installation of proxies and everything else is carried out. A request is made from a virtual machine using the HTTP2, HTTP3, IPv4 and IPv6 protocols respectively. You can see the results now in front of you. And in case you find a leak somewhere here, you can press Restart to do the test again in case you find a leak again and it has been fixed somewhere. In our case, there is no leak, so just press Yes, Yes, Y on the keyboard to start installing the Chrome browser. The Chrome browser is installed, as well as its minor configuration. That is, the time of its installation changes, it gets old, and some identifiers that affect the user's work in the Google ecosystem are also replaced. Of course, at the moment, not all identifiers have proven effectiveness, and many of them that we replace are only experimental functionality, but nevertheless, we have their substitution. So you don't have to worry about something identifying us in the Google ecosystem itself. Our browser will reboot several times, and the system will be fully ready to go. This is actually the final step. Expect. The window should close on its own. Here we see the window has closed. On the desktop, we have a folder with our proxy, Chrome, Standard Edge, and Recycle Bin. What should you pay attention to? Anti-OS tab. The Anti-OS tab has been present for a long time, but it appeared with new functionality relatively recently. What are its advantages? Let's break it down point by point. The first point is activating the operating system. Here I think everything is clear to you from the name itself. The second point is browser hardening. The browser hardening item allows you to make specific privacy settings in the Chrome browser. If you click on browser hardening, Chrome browser will close and its local files will be manipulated, which you can then see in the Chrome Flags tab. Next is geolocation. Accordingly, you can change the geolocation. If you suddenly created with one geolocation, you need to change to another. You can easily do it here without recreating the machine. Since I did not specify a geolocation, now this item is not available to me, and the system says that I need to create a geolocation. So here too, pay attention. If you did not set a geolocation when creating a virtual machine, then you will not be able to change it later. So I recommend setting geolocation. The next item is the Akamai Pamper item of the first version. Previously, there was a so-called old cookie pamper in this place, which allowed us to create cookies, let's say, actually using a time machine, as if we were already on this site. But the functionality of the old cookie bot, it remained with enable a virtual machine when you create it in the NTOS tab. Akamai Pamper, in this case, if we run it, we can look through the task manager, then it will start running many processes of the Chrome browser, i.e., in which it will visit web resources that are directly related to the Akamai system and will perform certain manipulations on these web resources. What? I'll keep it a secret for now since the functionality is experimental. There was no webinar on this functionality, nor any other information. Therefore, in the future, I will tell you how to use it correctly. At the moment, I will say this. If you use any web property that has the Akamai system on it, using Akamai Pamper will give you, well, by my calculations, about an extra 30% to, let's say, a humanity rating, so to speak. Next is VPN Hop Tuner. We will test it in practice. This feature allows you to hide your VPN usage. IPv6 control. In the event that your proxy does not support IPv6, you can disable it completely or accordingly perform the opposite action, that is, enable it. For working across the US, IPv6 is a critical element. For work in Europe, you can ignore it. The next item is the Strict Firewall item. Strict Firewall allows you to use, let's say, strict network control rules, and it disables all protocols except TCP, UDP, disables all broadcast protocols, disables priority exit of Windows services. That is, a minimum of possibilities for all subjects of the operating system, except for the browser itself and ordinary surfing. Applicable in rare cases. Basically, let's say this is the field of working with online casinos. Well, two rather old fingerprints, but which received their update due to the fact that we have updated the network adapter, are the M1D and M1D1 fingerprints, which, respectively, work for spoofing TCP packet headers and for spoofing UDP and ICMP packet headers. They received their update since in the settings of the network map we have a lot more modes at the moment than before. I'll show you now. That is, we go to our network card again. And here on the tab Advanced, you can see how much the functionality of the network card has expanded. And accordingly, what drives our network connection, our packages, is now available for more fine-tuning. Well, that's all, in fact, we can say. The only thing is that we have not yet tested the functionality for working with hops. Now, let's go over and try it, to take advantage of it. To get started, I'll insert a guest add-on disk and install OpenVPN software. This setting is to hide VPN usage. It only works with a VPN that is running on a virtual machine. But I would also like to clarify here more. Not all VPNs are suitable for this setting. It all depends on what architecture your file is. We don't have any file, so now we'll create one. And I'm importing now. Here are the settings of your VPN. Let's save this file under the name OVPN1. And we will check the functionality with you. So, let's pay attention to the following point. Go to the IP address tab. And now we see that where we use TCP IP fingerprint, we have the operating system defined as Windows MTU 1398 and distance 17 hops. That is, the distance from us to this web resource is 17 devices. By the way, please note that IPv6 leaks occur even when using a VPN, so in some cases OpenVPN, or rather IPv6, is better to block. Let's now turn off our VPN and see how long the distance is determined without it. Only 3 hops. That is, 3 devices are located between our real device and the web resource. Let's turn on the VPN again and use the functionality to change this parameter. Refresh the page. Here are our 17 hops. Go to the Anti-OS tab. Well, let's reduce by 5 hops. We are waiting for the command to be executed. Pay attention to the number 17. Updating our page. There was no change. We refresh the page again and we have already received only 5 hops. Here you can say that the math didn't work quite right, but unfortunately this happens depending on which VPN config you're using. Also, we can now on the VPN Hop Tuner tab, for example, let's lower by 3 hops. The command is loaded again. It all depends on how we installed this OpenVPN correctly. The fact is that in some cases, depending on how it was created and the owner of this server, he can prohibit, for example, the use of any identifiers by the host. By default, OpenVPN is always transparent, meaning it transmits the data transfer parameters completely, everything is the same as you have on your main host. But in some cases, depending on the architecture, the owner of the OpenVPN server can prohibit this process and overwrite the user's parameter using his parameters. In this case, this setting will not work, but nevertheless we see that now our number has changed respectively by 7. That is, thanks to the use of this simple setting, which you can see here, the TTL, time to live parameter, is manipulated. And accordingly, this time to live parameter increases or decreases. And thus, if we, for example, have a standard number of TTLs for the Windows operating system is 128, then minus 1, for example, this is 127. This is our router. That is, we understand that after our router, the TTL of our packages will always be 127. If a VPN is wedged in, then the TTL of packets that will reach this web resource can be, for example, 117, and so on. In order to compensate for this setting has been introduced, which allows you to increase the initial TTL parameter on our computer so that when connecting to the web resource itself, the web resource reaches exactly the clearly controlled amount of TTL that we need in order to hide the use of VPN. The setup is incredibly simple, but I'll probably tell you some surprising news. But this setting is very actively used in blocking VPN connections around the world. So you already have an antidote to it. Thank you for your attention. You had the Vector T13 with you.